This is video 1 from the Simio Modeling Framework module, and in this video we'll cover two topics. First of all, the object-oriented concepts as they pertain to Simio, as they're implemented in Simio, and secondly, the anatomy of a Simio object. As a note, we're going to cover a fair amount of material in this module that'll be a little bit vague for now. We'll clarify as we go through with the training. These are important concepts, and we basically have to start somewhere. So we decided we're going to start with this basic overview, and then we'll subsequently add details as we get further into the course. So Simio is an object-oriented package, and the implementation of these object-oriented concepts in Simio is specific to the simulation domain. And so an object is an instance of an object definition, and an object is placed in the facility view of a model. So let's open Simio and have a look. So when we look over on the left side, we see the standard library, and so if I were to drag the server object into the facility view, I've just created an instance of the object definition. So back to our slide, the object is an instance of an object definition, and it's placed in the facility view of a model. Note that in the Introduction to Simio module, we also talked about this so-called family of Simio objects, and we noted that we have an object definition shown here in the for the server object. We have an object instance, which in this case is server 1, and we do that to differentiate when we have multiple instances of the same object. So we have server instance 1, server instance 2 here, and for general terms, we will refer to these as just Simio objects. And as I mentioned previously, whether we're talking about the definition, the instance, or the run space, we'll clarify in context. So an object generally represents a physical component of the system, such as a customer, a worker, some type of machine, vehicle or transporter, or a pathway in which entities move. An object definition is defined in an object library or in the project. So let me pull Simio back up and talk just again briefly about that. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll go through this in much more detail in subsequent modules. But we have the standard library shown here, and so these are object definitions. I also have a flow library that we can look at, so it's a separate library, and we have different object definitions. And then we also have the project library, so object definitions can live within any one of these libraries, and then we can create instances of those in the facility view of the model. The behavior of an object is controlled and defined by that object's definition. And so if the definition changes, then all instances of that object definition might also change. So for example, if I go back to my model, and I'm going to create two instances of model entity. So I have default entity and model entity 1. So these are two different instances of this same model definition. If I go in and change the model entity somehow, and so again, we're going to come back to this in detail, so just bear with me here. Let's say that I add a property, and the property that I want to add is an integer property. Let's call it part type, for example. So I'm just going to name it part type. Then in the model entity definition, we've added a property called part type. And so back in our model, if I go over to the navigation, pick model, both instances of the model entity object definition now have a property called part type. And so that's an important concept in that the behavior is defined within the object definition, and all instances of that object then inherit that behavior. Object definitions are defined or derived from a base class, and that base class defines the individual object's core functionality. And so the Simio object model, the base class is an intelligent object, and from that we have fixed objects, link objects, node objects, and then we have the dynamic objects. So these are all static. Fixed link and node objects are static. The green agent, entity, and transporter are dynamic. And note that these are base classes, so we don't actually create object instances from these. Instead, we create objects using individual classes as base. So if we jump into Simio and we look at the standard library, for example, the source, sink, server, combiner, separator, resource are all use the fixed class as base. The vehicle and worker use the transporter as base. The basic node and transfer node use the node object as base, and the connector, path, time path, and conveyor all use the link object as base. And so you can see that we have a set of fixed objects, or set of objects in the standard library derived from fixed, from link, from node. We also have model entity, which is defined from entity, and then, as I mentioned, the transporter and worker objects use the transporter object as the base object. So we'll go through these in much more detail in subsequent modules, and the key takeaway here is that we have this hierarchy of base classes, and that the objects from the standard library and other libraries are derived from these basic objects, and these base objects provide functionality that can then be extended as we derive objects. So a Simio object has the basic anatomy is shown here, that you have a logic which defines the behavior, and this logic is described in terms of Simio processes or objects, as we'll see. You have an external view. This is essentially what the user sees. So when I drag an object instance onto the facility view, the external view is what defines what you actually see. And then we have an interface, which is the user, the modeler's interface to the object, that generally consists of static inputs and dynamic inputs that determine how the model, or how the object behaves. So let's have a look into what exactly the components of an object are. So to do that, I'm going to pull up Simio here, and note again we have two basic object definitions in our current model. We have model itself, and then we have model entity. And if I look at model, I look at these components across the top, and if I switch to model entity, we see its components across the top also. And so when we talk about processes, definitions, and data associated with model entity, and then we have the processes, definitions, and the data, and in addition we have the facility view, the results, and the planning, that are all components of those objects. And so we see that all objects have processes, definitions, and data, and that depending on the base class, the object may have a facility view, and if the objects are runnable, which we will see a little bit later what that means, we'll also see the results tab, or the results component, and the planning component. Note also that the planning component, as shown by this asterisk, depends on the Simio license that you have. Some licenses support the planning function, planning tab, and some licenses don't. So that will depend on the license. So we're going to discuss all of these things again in subsequent videos, but what we want to end this video on is talking a little bit about the definitions. In particular, if you look at the definitions, so if I pull Simio back up and then go to my model and then go to the definitions tab, these are the definitions that are associated with the object. So go back here, and you can see I have those listed here. These are all the definitions that we saw from Simio, and we will discuss these, all of these, at some point during the training. In this video, we will end talking about elements, and then in a subsequent video in this module, we will talk about properties and states, and all of the italicized definitions we'll talk about in subsequent modules. So elements. An element, by definition, is a collection of properties or states and events and behaviors, and it's built into Simio. It's a little bit difficult to get your arms around what precisely it is, but the key notion here is that it's built into Simio. So these were developed by the Simio developers, and we will use these to in our model to describe behaviors and to track statistics and costs and things like that. And so again, it's a little bit difficult to define, but the key component here is that we will see all of these elements, and that they are built into Simio, and so you don't add elements, you just use the built-in elements in the modeling. So that concludes video 1 in this module.